Amid the shadowy rise of the early Han dynasty, where jealousy and intrigue ruled the palace halls, a young concubine, beloved rival of Empress Lü Zhi, was sentenced to burn alive. At only 30, her screams vanished into the crackling blaze, leaving the harem in chilling silence. Her death was more than personal tragedy. It revealed the ruthless extremes of imperial power. The Han dynasty was born out of fire, chaos, and bloodshed. After the fall of the Qin, Liu Bang, once a peasant rebel, rose to seize the throne and founded the Han Empire. In this fragile dawn of a new dynasty, the palace was not only the heart of political power, but also the stage for human passions, jealousies, and betrayals. At the center of this vast court stood Empress Lü Zhi, the legitimate wife of the founding emperor. She was a woman whose name would one day be remembered with awe and fear, not only for her political cunning, but also for the chilling cruelty she was capable of. The early Han court was a place of sharp contrasts. Outside the palace walls, peasants and soldiers struggled to rebuild their lives after years of war. Inside, ministers debated laws, generals planned campaigns, and scholars attempted to craft the ideological foundation of the empire. Yet within the private chambers of the palace, another battlefield was unfolding, one far more silent, but no less deadly. This was the world of the harem, the women's quarters, where every smile and every word could determine survival or doom. Empress Lü Zhi, as the official wife of Emperor Gaozu, Liu Bang, initially appeared to occupy an unshakable position. She had borne him children, including the son who was the legitimate heir. But court life was not secure for women, even for empresses. The emperor's affections were fickle, shifting like the winds, and beauty or youth could overturn years of loyalty and labor. For Lü Zhi, the struggle was not only for her husband's love, but for her son's future and for her own survival in a palace where rivals multiplied with every passing season. The structure of the harem magnified these tensions. Scores of concubines entered the palace, some gifted by nobles, some taken from conquered families, others chosen for their beauty. To the emperor, they were a source of pleasure. But to one another, they were enemies competing for the most precious resource of all, imperial favor. A single glance from the ruler could elevate a woman to riches and honor, or condemn her to obscurity and despair. Behind the silken curtains of the inner palace, alliances were forged, betrayals plotted, and lives destroyed without ever drawing a blade. Lü Zhi understood this reality better than most. Patient, calculating, and proud, she carried herself with a dignity that demanded respect. Yet beneath her calm exterior lay years of bitterness. As the emperor grew distant, surrounded by younger and more beautiful concubines, the empress's pride hardened into something darker. She still held the title of empress, and she still had her son, but she was forced to watch as her rivalries thrived. She was no longer the center of her husband's world, and each moment of neglect deepened the wound. The palace whispers grew louder. Ministers and attendants noted the emperor's shifting attention. The empress, once radiant beside him in ceremony, now stood apart, her eyes shadowed with suspicion. Her rivals, emboldened by the emperor's affection, dared to flaunt their beauty, their laughter echoing through the corridors like knives in the empress's ears. The harem became a silent war zone, a place where every gift, every banquet, every rumor was a move on a chessboard of survival. The early Han dynasty was still fragile, and every decision at court carried weight beyond the palace. Yet in those gilded chambers, the personal became political. Lü Zhi's insecurity as a wife, her fear as a mother, and her rage as a rival would one day shape the fate of the dynasty itself. For the woman who challenged her, The cost would not be mere exile or disgrace, but something far more horrifying. For now, however, that storm still gathered silently, hidden beneath the surface of ceremonies and rituals. No one yet realized that jealousy, once unleashed, could burn brighter than any empire. Among the concubines who entered the palace of Emperor Gaozu, there was one whose beauty and charm eclipsed the others. She was young, graceful, and intelligent, and she possessed a quiet strength that drew the emperor to her side. Unlike many concubines who relied only on beauty, she could speak with wit, offer counsel, and soothe the temper of the ruler who had carved an empire from rebellion. In her presence, Liu Bang found relief from the endless burdens of statecraft. She became his solace, his favored companion, and eventually his obsession. The palace quickly took notice. Servants whispered in the corridors about the emperor's new favorite. Ministers, though careful with their words, recognized that her influence could sway decisions. The woman, who had no official title beyond that of a concubine, commanded the emperor's affection in ways that threatened the balance of the court. Her beauty was not just physical. It was alive, radiant, and undeniable. Wherever she walked, she carried the aura of one who had captured the heart of the Son of Heaven. For Empress Lü Zhi, this was unbearable. She had endured years at Liu Bang's side, shared his hardships, and borne him heirs. She had waited for the day when, as Empress, she would stand unchallenged beside him in glory. Instead, she now found herself overshadowed by a woman half her age, who had given nothing to the empire except her youth and beauty. Each time the emperor turned away from her to smile upon his concubine, each night that he spent in another's chamber, the empress felt her dignity sliced away, piece by piece. The court ladies and eunuchs saw what was happening, though few dared to speak of it openly. The emperor's laughter echoed more often in the rivals' chambers than in the empress's hall. Lavish gifts flowed into her apartments: silks, jewels, and perfumes. Musicians played in her honor, and feasts were held with her at the emperor's side. She was no longer merely a concubine. She was the woman who had stolen the emperor's heart. For the other concubines, this was a cause for envy. For Empress Lü Zhi, it was a direct humiliation. What made the rivalry so dangerous was not merely jealousy, but the fact that the emperor seemed determined to elevate this woman above all others. Rumors spread that he might grant her a higher rank, perhaps even bestow upon her son, if she bore one, the favor of succession. Such whispers were like poison to the empress. For Lü Zhi, the stakes were not only personal pride, but the future of her own children, her legacy, and her survival. A rival who gained too much power could destroy everything she had built. The young woman, however, was not reckless. She carried herself with grace, perhaps unaware of the depth of hatred her presence was cultivating. To her, the emperor's affection was love, pure and simple. She may have believed that she had secured her place through devotion rather than manipulation. But in the dangerous world of the palace, innocence was no shield. Every glance she received from the emperor, every laugh they shared, was another knife twisting in the empress's heart. The stage was set. The early Han dynasty, already fragile in politics, now simmered with personal rivalries that would erupt into cruelty. One woman's beauty and youth had sparked the wrath of another's jealousy and fear. For now, the young concubine basked in the glow of imperial favor, her future appearing as radiant as the silks that adorned her. Yet behind the curtain, Lü Zhi was watching, waiting, and calculating. And when the moment came, her rival would pay the ultimate price. When Emperor Gaozu of Han passed away, the empire trembled at the edge of uncertainty. The ruler who had forged a dynasty was gone, leaving behind a young successor and a court filled with ambitions. At the center of this shifting world stood Empress Lü Zhi, no longer bound by the overshadowing presence of her husband. She became Empress Dowager, the most powerful woman in the empire. No man, no general, and no minister could rival her grip on the throne. Yet in the depths of her heart, her power was poisoned by a single memory: the rival who had stolen the emperor's affections. During Liu Bang's lifetime, this concubine had been untouchable. Shielded by his favor, she walked through the palace with an air of untouchable grace. Even Lü Zhi, as empress, could not openly strike at her without risking the emperor's wrath. But death changes all balances of power. With the emperor's body sealed in the imperial tomb, the protection that had guarded the young woman vanished. For Lü Zhi, the years of humiliation and jealousy could now be avenged without restraint. The palace transformed after the emperor's passing. Ministers deferred to the Empress Dowager, generals sought her approval, and her son sat as a figurehead upon the throne. The harem, once noisy with laughter and rivalries, grew silent under the weight of her authority. Every woman within the palace walls now lived in fear, for all understood that the Empress Dowager's wrath could consume them at any moment. Yet for one concubine, the danger was greater than for all the others combined. The rival was still young, only 30 years of age. She carried the same beauty that had captivated Liu Bang, but beauty was now her curse. In the eyes of Lü Zhi, she was not simply another concubine. She was a living reminder of betrayal, a symbol of humiliation that refused to fade. Each time Lü Zhi glimpsed her, the years of bitterness boiled over. To allow her to live was intolerable. To destroy her was necessary, not only to satisfy jealousy, but also to demonstrate to the entire court what became of those who threatened the empress's supremacy. The Empress Dowager began her campaign with subtlety. Whispers circulated that the young woman harbored ambitions beyond her station, that she sought to undermine the heir, that her influence during the late emperor's life had been dangerous. These were not accusations based on truth, but in the palace, truth mattered little. Perception was everything. Ministers nodded in agreement. Concubines whispered in fear. And soon, a narrative was shaped. The rival was not merely a woman of beauty, but a potential traitor to the dynasty. As the days passed, the tension grew unbearable. The rival, once radiant, now appeared pale and haunted. She sensed that her days of protection were over, yet she could do nothing. Appeals to ministers were useless, for all served the Empress Dowager. To flee the palace was impossible. Its walls were both golden and iron. She was trapped within a cage that had once seemed like paradise. This was the spark that ignited the inferno. For Lü Zhi, the humiliation of years demanded a spectacle of vengeance. Quiet exile or simple execution would not suffice. She craved a punishment that would erase not only the rival's life, but also her memory, one that would leave every concubine trembling in silence. The fire of jealousy had smoldered for years, and now it was ready to burst into a blaze that would consume the young woman entirely. The decision was made in secrecy, but the outcome was intended to be as public as possible. Empress Dowager Lü Zhi resolved that her rival would not die quietly. A blade would be too swift, poison too merciful. The sentence had to strike fear into every corner of the palace. Thus, she chose fire. To be burned alive was a punishment not merely of death, but of shame, agony, and spectacle. It was the most terrifying tool of control, one that transformed an execution into a warning for all who might dare to defy her. The charges were vague, deliberately so. The rival was accused of conspiracy, whispers of treachery, of plotting rebellion within the palace walls. No evidence was required. The Empress Dowager's word was law, and her decree was enough to seal the woman's fate. Ministers, whether they believed the charges or not, bowed their heads in obedience. None would dare to oppose her. To challenge her authority was to invite destruction. The trial, if it could be called one, was nothing more than a formality. The verdict was predetermined, the sentence unavoidable. In the dimly lit halls of the palace, the decree was read aloud. Courtiers stood in silence, their faces betraying neither agreement nor dissent. They knew that eyes were watching, that any sign of sympathy could doom them as well. The young woman stood accused, her name blackened by lies, her honor stripped away. She was no longer the emperor's beloved concubine, but a condemned traitor whose death would serve as an example. The Empress Dowager's cruelty had been given a mask of justice. Word spread quickly through the palace. Servants whispered in corners, eunuchs hurried through corridors, concubines hid their terror behind lowered eyes. The rival, once celebrated for her beauty, was now spoken of as doomed. Some pitied her in secret, remembering her laughter, her kindness, her quiet grace. Others turned away, eager to erase her from memory before they too could be tainted by association. In the palace, survival demanded silence. Compassion was a luxury that few could afford. The rival herself was summoned to the chamber where the sentence would be delivered. She walked with trembling steps, her once bright eyes now shadowed by dread. She knew the Empress Dowager's hatred. She had long felt it in the cold glances, the subtle slights, the lingering tension whenever their paths crossed. Now it had taken shape in the form of a decree. There would be no escape, no reprieve. Her fate was sealed. Empress Dowager Lü Zhi sat upon her throne, her expression carved from stone. The decree was read, and the words of condemnation echoed through the chamber like a funeral bell. The rival fell to her knees, her tears silent but unyielding. She begged not for mercy, for she knew there would be none, but for her death to be quick. Instead, she was told of the pyre that awaited her. The fire would consume her body, but her cries would serve as a lesson for every soul who lived under the shadow of the palace. Thus the sentence was fixed. Preparations began at once. Wood was gathered, the execution ground chosen, guards assigned. The harem trembled as the reality of the punishment became clear. A woman who had once walked with beauty and grace was about to be transformed into ash before their very eyes. The Empress Dowager had not only ensured the rival's destruction, she had orchestrated a spectacle that would bind the entire court in fear. The night before the execution was a silence heavier than chains. The young concubine, once radiant in silks, now sat within a narrow cell of stone and shadow. The air was damp, carrying the scent of straw and iron, and the faint torchlight flickered against the walls like restless spirits. She was only 30 years of age, yet her life was already ending. In that confined darkness, she could almost hear the whispers of fate closing around her. She had no illusions. The Empress Dowager's decree was absolute. Once the words were spoken, there was no appeal, no mercy. Death was certain. The form it would take, flames, agony, smoke, was the part that chilled her to her very bones. She had witnessed executions before, though none as cruel as the fate chosen for her. To be burned alive was to suffer in ways beyond comprehension. It was not only the destruction of the body, but also the annihilation of dignity. She would be made into a spectacle. Her death turned into a lesson for others. Her thoughts drifted backwards, to the days when she first entered the palace. She remembered the gardens of spring, where flowers bloomed under the watchful gaze of the emperor. She remembered his laughter, warm and genuine, when she dared to speak freely. She remembered the way he looked at her, as though she was not merely another concubine, but someone who brought him peace in the midst of endless turmoil. For a moment, she had believed in love. Fragile though it was, within the walls of power. But love within a palace was not protection. It was poison. It had painted a target upon her, and the Empress Dowager had sharpened her jealousy into a weapon. Now, in the cold silence of her cell, the young woman realized that her greatest blessing had been her greatest curse. She whispered to herself, recalling the warmth of the emperor's hand, as if holding on to that memory could keep the terror of tomorrow at bay. Tears came quietly, unbidden. She wept not only for herself, but for the years she would never see. She thought of the children she would never bear, the songs she would never sing, the seasons she would never watch pass. She had only 30 years, and within those years she had risen high and fallen low, all within the confines of stone walls gilded with splendor. Her destiny had never truly belonged to her. It had always been dictated by others, by the emperor's desire, by the empress's jealousy, by the machinery of power that devoured individuals like offerings. The guards outside the cell shifted uneasily. They could hear her quiet sobs, though none dared to show sympathy. To speak kindly to her would invite suspicion. To show pity might be taken as disloyalty. They stood still, staring at the torches, pretending not to notice the tragedy unfolding behind the iron bars. The palace itself seemed to breathe in silence, as though the walls knew what was coming. As the night deepened, she lay down upon the straw, though sleep did not come. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of movement, every flicker of flame reminded her of the pyre waiting for her. The hours stretched endlessly, each moment heavy with dread. Yet, amid the terror, there was a strange calm. Death was inevitable. She had nothing left to bargain with, no one left to plead to. All she could do was face the dawn and the flames it would bring. Thus, the last night of her life passed in quiet sorrow. There were no friends, no family, no lover to comfort her. Only the shadows kept her company, and the knowledge that when the sun rose, she would walk into fire. The morning arrived with the sound of drums. Deep and resonant, the rhythm echoed through the palace like the heartbeat of fate. Servants hurried about, guards lined the corridors, and the air carried the smell of smoke before the fire had even been lit. Today was not merely an execution. It was theater, carefully designed by the Empress Dowager to display her power in the most terrifying form. The young woman was brought from her cell, her wrists bound with rope, her hair unadorned, her steps unsteady. She no longer wore silks, only plain garments that spoke of disgrace, yet even stripped of beauty and dignity. There was a fragile nobility in her face. She raised her eyes to the sky, as though searching for strength from heavens that had long abandoned her. Around her, the silence of the harem was absolute. Every concubine, every servant, every official knew that this day would be remembered. The execution ground had been prepared with grim precision. Logs of wood had been piled high, a pyre built taller than a man. Kindling had been set beneath, dry branches that would catch flame in an instant. Guards stood in a ring, their armor gleaming in the pale light. Behind them, the crowd gathered, courtiers, ministers, attendants, all summoned to witness the fate of the Empress Dowager's rival. Attendance was not optional. To stay away was to risk suspicion. To attend was to bear witness to terror. As she was led forward, the young woman's gaze moved over the crowd. She saw no sympathy, only fear. Eyes turned away, lips pressed tightly, faces carved in stone. No one dared to meet her eyes for long, lest it be seen as compassion. She stood alone, utterly abandoned, the object of collective silence. Even in her final moments, she was denied acknowledgement as a human being. The drums grew louder, the beats rolling like thunder. With each strike, the guards moved closer, binding her to the wooden post at the center of the pyre. The ropes cut into her wrists and ankles, holding her fast against the wood that would soon be her tomb. She trembled, not with weakness, but with the sheer horror of what awaited. Still, she lifted her chin, refusing to collapse in despair before her enemies. Then came the fire. A torch was lowered to the kindling, and within moments the dry branches roared to life. Flames licked upward, eager and merciless, devouring the wood with a crackling fury. Heat surged through the air, pressing against her skin even before the fire touched her. The smoke curled upward, black and suffocating, veiling the sky as though the heavens themselves turned away. The crowd stood in silence, bound by fear. No cries of mercy, no pleas for compassion rose. Only the sound of the fire, the relentless crackling, and the muted thunder of the drums filled the air. The young woman's voice broke through, a cry that echoed across the execution ground. It was not only pain, but defiance, a final cry of existence before the flames claimed her breath. As the fire grew, her figure blurred within the smoke. Her body writhed against the ropes, the flames crawling higher, until her cries became hoarse and then faded into the roar of the blaze. The Empress Dowager watched, her face expressionless, her satisfaction hidden behind a mask of authority. The harem, the ministers, the court, all witnessed the same truth. Power was not gentle. It was merciless, absolute, and it consumed without hesitation. The flames soared higher, and with them, fear spread deeper into the hearts of all who watched. The Empress Dowager had achieved her aim. The rival was gone, and the fire had left behind not only ashes, but also a silence so heavy that it would haunt the palace for years. The flames wrapped themselves around her like living creatures, devouring every part of her body with merciless hunger. At first, there was sound. Piercing cries that echoed across the courtyard, sharp enough to pierce even the hardest hearts. But the voices of the crowd did not rise in response. There was no chorus of pity, no outcry against injustice. Only silence accompanied her agony, a silence that was more chilling than the fire itself. Her figure writhed against the ropes, struggling instinctively, even though her mind knew there was no escape. The smoke rose thick and black, veiling her in a shroud of shadows, while the flames burned so bright that her outline blurred. Her face contorted with unbearable pain, and her mouth opened in a final scream that dissolved into smoke. The fire was both executioner and jailer, consuming flesh and bone, stripping away the woman who had once been a beloved companion of the emperor. Those who stood in the crowd dared not look for long. Some turned their faces away, others lowered their heads, but all heard her cries. The sound lodged itself deep into their memories, a horror that no silence could erase. The guards stood motionless, their expressions blank, as though carved from stone. They had been ordered to witness, not to feel. Ministers and courtiers, men who shaped the empire's laws, stared with eyes empty of compassion. They had learned that to survive within the court of Lü Zhi was to surrender one's humanity. In the women's quarters, the concubines watched through veiled screens, their hands trembling, their lips pressed tightly together. For them, the execution was not only the death of a rival, but also a warning of what could await them. The flames seemed to leap higher with every moment, as if eager to remind them that no beauty, no charm, no affection from the emperor could save them from the wrath of the empress. Fear took root in their hearts, deeper and more enduring than grief. The young woman's body twisted as the fire climbed, until her movements slowed, weakened, and finally stilled. The cries faded into ragged gasps, then into silence. The only sound was the relentless crackle of burning wood and the rhythmic drums that marked the inevitability of her fate. Her final breath vanished into smoke, carried away by the wind, leaving behind nothing but ash. In that moment, the palace grew unbearably quiet. It was as if the entire empire held its breath. The concubines, the ministers, the guards, all lowered their eyes, unwilling to acknowledge the horror they had witnessed. To speak of it would be dangerous. To mourn would be treason. The woman who had once been adored was now reduced to nothing more than dust. Empress Dowager Lü Zhi remained still throughout, her expression carved into a mask of cold detachment. If she felt triumph, she did not reveal it. If she felt satisfaction, she allowed no trace to show. Her silence was more frightening than words, for it suggested that such cruelty was not born of passion, but of calculation. She had demonstrated her power in the most terrifying way possible, and she had done so with the calm of one who believed she was simply upholding order. The ashes of the young concubine scattered upon the ground, mingling with the dust of the courtyard. No one dared to collect them, no one dared to honor them. The fire had not only destroyed her body, but also attempted to erase her memory. Yet in the hearts of those who watched, her death lingered as a shadow. It was not love, nor admiration, nor grief that remained. It was fear. And fear was precisely the legacy that Lü Zhi intended to leave behind. After the fire had died, the court attempted to return to its routines, but nothing was the same. The harem, once filled with laughter, gossip, and subtle rivalries, was now subdued, cloaked in silence. Every woman moved with measured steps, careful not to draw attention, careful not to reveal a spark of ambition. The execution had carved itself into their souls. The sight of the flames, the sound of screams, the smell of burning flesh. These had become permanent reminders of what awaited anyone who threatened the supremacy of the Empress Dowager. The concubines who had once dared to compete for affection no longer spoke of such things. Even the boldest among them chose silence, hiding behind lowered eyes and trembling hands. To be noticed was to be endangered. They understood that their lives were fragile, that the favor of the emperor could vanish in an instant, and that Lü Zhi's wrath could strike at any time. The fire had not only consumed one woman, it had consumed the very spirit of defiance within the harem. Among the servants, whispers circulated in hushed tones, shared only in the darkest corners. They spoke of the rival who had burned, of the beauty that had vanished into smoke. But always the whispers ended in silence, for fear that even the walls could betray them. To speak too much, to linger on forbidden memories, was to invite suspicion. The palace was alive with fear, and fear was more effective than chains. The ministers of the court understood the message as well. Many had wives or daughters within the harem, and they saw clearly that none were beyond danger. Lü Zhi had proven that she would not hesitate to destroy anyone who stood against her, even if that person had once been beloved by the emperor himself. Her power was absolute, her reach unchallenged. The fire was not only punishment, it was a declaration. The dynasty belonged to her as much as it belonged to the young heir who sat upon the throne. Over time, the rival's name faded. Official records were silent, deliberately so. Chronicles of the court spoke only of Lü Zhi's triumphs and decisions, never of the woman who had died in the flames. Her existence was erased, as though she had never lived. But memories are not so easily destroyed. In quiet moments, concubines remembered her laughter. In the shadows of night, servants recalled her kindness. Even ministers who had watched in silence could not forget the terror of her final cries. The fire had been intended to erase, but instead it had etched her memory into the very foundations of fear. For Lü Zhi, this was victory. The harem bent to her will without resistance. No rival dared to rise. No concubine dared to hope for more than survival. The empire itself seemed to bend beneath her, acknowledging her as the true master of the court. The fire had served its purpose. It had eliminated one rival, yes, but it had also transformed the palace into a place where obedience was the only language spoken. The halls of the harem grew colder in the years that followed. Music no longer echoed as it once had. The fragrance of flowers no longer lingered in the air. The women of the palace lived as shadows, surviving day by day under the gaze of a ruler who had shown them what fate awaited those who displeased her. The fire had died, but its shadow endured. The palace was quiet, but beneath that quiet lay the weight of terror, a silence that would never truly fade. History has always been written by the victors, and within the palace of the Han dynasty, the victor was Empress Dowager Lü Zhi. The official records that chronicled the reign of emperors and empresses made no mention of the concubine who had once captured the heart of Liu Bang. Her existence was deliberately obscured, her name swallowed by silence. It was as though fire had not only consumed her body, but had also erased her from the scrolls of time. Yet the human heart does not forget so easily. In whispered tales shared by servants, in the hushed lullabies of concubines who feared the same fate, fragments of her story endured. They spoke not of rebellion nor of treachery, but of a woman whose only crime was to be loved too deeply by a man who was already bound to another. These whispers, fragile as they were, carried the weight of a curse. It was said that the palace itself remained haunted by the smoke of her death, that the scent of burning wood lingered in the halls whenever jealousy stirred. Her silence had become a phantom, haunting those who had witnessed her end. Among the concubines who survived, the memory of the fire was a chain that bound their tongues. They lived in constant fear, repressing even the thought of defiance. The image of her burning became their warning, a cruel prophecy that love in the palace was not a blessing, but a sentence. They buried their desires deep within, suppressing laughter, hiding ambition, surrendering entirely to the cold reality that survival required invisibility. This was the true legacy of the rival's death. Not merely the loss of one life, but the enslavement of countless others to the silence of fear. Beyond the palace walls, however, the people whispered different stories. In the villages and towns, where official decrees did not reach as quickly, tales of the burned concubine transformed into legend. She became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of injustice. Mothers warned their daughters of the cruelty of the palace, telling them that beauty could be both gift and curse. Folk songs carried faint echoes of her tragedy, disguised in allegories so that no authority could silence them. Her memory became a shadowy legend, preserved not in the ink of court historians, but in the voices of ordinary people. Still, the silence of official history was suffocating. By erasing her, the Empress Dowager had tried to ensure that her power would never be questioned. The rival's suffering was reduced to a rumor, a ghostly echo that dared not take shape on the scrolls. But history has a way of resurrecting the forgotten. Each retelling in secret, each whisper in fear, was a defiance against the attempt to erase her. Though her name was lost, her death survived as a warning, a curse that hovered over the dynasty. The silence itself became her vengeance. Every concubine who trembled at the memory of flames, every minister who avoided meeting her eyes as she burned, every servant who dared not speak her name, each carried the burden of complicity. In this way, her death lived on, not through monuments or memorials, but through the shame and terror that the survivors could never wash away. The curse of silence was stronger than words, and it bound the palace in fear long after her ashes had scattered to the wind. The tragedy of the burned concubine was not only the end of one woman's life, it was the reflection of a greater truth about the nature of power. In the early Han Dynasty, authority was not a shield for the innocent, but a weapon wielded by the strong. Empress Dowager Lü Zhi embodied this reality. To secure her place, she used cruelty as strategy, erasure as policy, and terror as governance. The death of her rival revealed how fragile human life was in the machinery of empire, and how easily love could be crushed beneath the weight of ambition. At only 30 years of age, the young woman had been destroyed, not for treachery, nor for rebellion, but for daring to be loved. Her beauty, her intelligence, and her closeness to the emperor had marked her as dangerous in the eyes of the empress. Her execution was not justice. It was vengeance cloaked in ritual. Her life was extinguished to satisfy jealousy, and her memory was buried to preserve authority. In her suffering, the cruel truth of the palace was laid bare. Affection was a liability. Youth was a threat, and survival was determined not by virtue, but by submission. The spectacle of her death echoed across the harem and the court. It silenced ambition, crushed spirit, and replaced love with fear. The women who remained understood that they were not companions, but pawns, their fates determined by whims beyond their control. Ministers understood that their silence preserved their survival, even as it stained their consciences. The empire continued, but beneath its ceremonies and triumphs lay the ashes of those who had been sacrificed to maintain its order. Lü Zhi herself became a figure both feared and remembered. History would record her as the first empress to hold true power in the Han Dynasty, but it would also paint her with the brush of cruelty. The burned concubine's fate, though erased from official annals, became part of the shadow that followed Lü Zhi's name for centuries. The empress had secured her dominance, but she had also bound her legacy to the memory of brutality. Power gained through fear is never free of ghosts. For those who reflect on this tragedy today, the story resonates beyond its time. It reminds us that power, when divorced from compassion, becomes destruction. It shows that human lives can be reduced to tokens in the struggle for supremacy, that love itself can be weaponized as cause for death. The young woman's agony was not in vain, for it forces later generations to ask, what price is paid for power? And who is sacrificed to uphold it? Her death, though cloaked in silence, survives as a lesson. It speaks to the fragility of human existence, the cruelty of unchecked authority, and the futility of seeking love in a place where jealousy reigns supreme. At the age of 30, she became ash, but her tragedy became eternal. She is remembered not by name, but by the flames that consumed her. And through those flames, history whispers a warning. In the storm of power, beauty, love, and youth are fragile, and without mercy, they are destined to become nothing more than dust.